God himself doesn't seem to want me to finish this video. I've started it a couple of times and people keep interrupting me. But anyways, Ultimate Fighter, not Ultimate Fighter, pardon me, UFC Ultimate Fight Night, number something double-digited. I don't really remember. We have Ryan Jensen versus Steve Steinbeiss. Not even going to dignify this fight with a pick because it shouldn't be happening, because neither should be on contract. Brock Larson versus Mike Pierce. Brock Larson, Jeremy Stevens, Justin Buchwald, Jeremy Stevens, Sam Stout, Philip Nover, Mike Pyle, Chris Wilson, and Brian Stam versus Steve Cantwell. On to the main card and the more in-depth reviewing. Nate Quarry versus Tim Crater, 17-3 versus 13-4. Crater is 6'3". Didn't know that, actually. He's pretty tall, actually. Crater is coming off of a impressive winning streak, I guess, over Cale Yarborough, Nate Logren, and Nick Catone. The latter two being more impressive wins. Cale Yarborough is more... everyone thought he was going to win that fight. The other two are somewhat more surprising. Corey is, of course, been in the UFC for quite some time. Not as many fights as you would think for a guy who's been around since made his UFC debut back in April of 2005. Of course, coming off Ultimate Fighter 1. He is compiled a record of 6-2. Losses to Demian Maia and Rich Franklin, which are no laughing matter. Coming off of a TKO victory over my favorite fighter, Jason McDonald. That being said, the chances that Corey's heavy hands are really going to discourage a tough guy who really doesn't have a problem with getting hit, and that's Tim Crater, is somewhat of a pipe dream. Not to say you can't knock him out, but I wouldn't bet heavy money on it. I'm a little surprised that Corey is the big favorite he is, because he's dealing with a guy who I think has all the tools to beat him. I think he has a decent wrestling chance. I'm talking about Crater. I think he has a definitive round advantage, being a black belt. I think he actually has better technical stand-up and better speed. Corey, I think, has the definitive power edge, as he generally does. But the heavy-handed Nate Corey, I think, will fall via submission in the second round to Timmy Crater. Carlos Condit coming off of a somewhat disappointing UFC debut against Martin Kampmann. Not that, I thought he left anything at the door in the fight. It just happens to be a loss. He's fighting a UFC debut in Jake Ellenberger. I could have sworn this fight was supposed to be between Condit and someone else, but I can't really remember who that was. Ellenberger is a very good wrestler, Team Quest trained guy with some stand-up and some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ability, but I think it pales in comparison to the striking ability and BJJ that Carlos Condit brings to the table. I think on the wrestling side, Ellenberger is going to be able to take this fight to the ground. That being said, I think once it's there, I think he's going to have a lot of problems with Carlos Condit. I think Condit's going to show him just a higher level of ability off his back than anyone else really previously shown. I mean, Condit's done this to a lot of people. I mean, you look at his run through the WEC welterweight division, where he was, of course, a champion. He beat some good grapplers via submission, like Carlo Prater, John Alessio, and Brock Larson. And Larson's a big, strong guy. I would say a lot stronger than Ellenberger. And I got to give this one to Condit via a second round submission. Gray Maynard versus Roger Huerta. Gray Maynard is a big, strong, bully-like wrestler who's shown some stand-up recently and is undefeated in his career, with, of course, the lone blemish being his draw with Rob Emerson. He has wins during his UFC time over Joe Varys, Dennis Seaver, Frank Edgar, Rich Clementi, and Jim Miller. The most impressive of those is probably Jim Miller. He hasn't finished anyone of note. His only finish in the UFC is Joe Varys. And Roger Huerta is an iron-chinned warrior who I think will probably take him the distance again. But I think Maynard can handle it. I think this is going to look a lot like the Frankie Edgar-Gray Maynard fight, where Maynard's just too big and strong for Huerta to deal with, because I think he's also a better wrestler, of course. We haven't seen Huerta since August of 2009, or 2008, pardon me, when he fought Kenny Florian and was disturbing. Of course, everyone knows my opinion on the protectiveness of Huerta over his career. The fact that he fought 5 straight fighters making their UFC debut was, I think, ridiculous. And when he finally fought someone who was not making their debut, it was Clay Guida. And Guida was beating him pretty handily up until that point. And I think that in itself kind of shows the pattern for this fight. I think Maynard's going to be able to take him down. I think Maynard's going to be able to control him. I don't think Huerta submits him. In the main event, Nate Diaz, Melvin Guillard, which is a terrible main event. Has really no title implications. Diaz's ball is completely stopped, and basically I think this is an attempt to get him going after losing to Clay Guida and Joe Stevenson in back-to-back fights recently. I think it'll work because we know Melvin Guillard doesn't really have much of a ground game, despite his recent win over Gleason Tebow maybe showing he's developing some. But he really is a guy who's going to try and knock you out, and that's been his way of winning. His only win other than that is the aforementioned Tebow fight. And I don't think it'll work because I think Diaz is a tough... I don't think anyone needs to actually bring up Diaz's toughness. He's Diaz. They're tough bastards. That's kind of how it works. Diaz has, I think, actually better striking than Guillard in some respects. It's very different than Guillard's, and it's not something I think, up-and-coming fighters should pick up, but it seems to work for him. And he's a great deal better on the ground. I think that's eventually this fight's going to end up with a submission victory for Nate Diaz. My thoughts on the card. It's a pretty good card, although it really doesn't have a main event to write home about, but that's just my opinion.